the newsagents.
We will pass new laws to stop small boats.
We've introduced tough new measures today to help us stop the boats.
Because when I said at the beginning of the year that we would stop the boats, I meant it. One of my 5 priorities is to stop the boats because I think the current system is both unsustainable and is completely unfair.
Rishi Sunak has barely been a week without telling us about his plans to stop the boats. We know that. But right now, he wants to stop the students. He wants to push ahead with curbs to overseas graduate visas. And today, we're going to ask what the knock-on effect of that could be.
Because a number of universities could quite literally go bust if the government goes ahead with this move. It would please the right on the Conservative Party, but is it an act of vandalism to our education system when we want to be a world-beating economy? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emma.
And later, I have been interviewing Alexander Zinchenko, the Arsenal left-back, but also probably one of the most famous Ukrainians in the UK. He's 27 years old. He's not going out to nightclubs and getting drunk every night. He is concerned about what is happening in his own country and has an enormous weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He is fascinating about being a professional footballer, but also about what is happening to his country.
That is to come, but we're going to start with the whole question of student visas, which has suddenly got very political after what we understand to be an intervention by the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, warning his own Prime Minister, our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, that universities are going to face certainly job losses and possibly closure if Rishi Sunak goes ahead with these curbs on graduate visas. And as you know, over the last week, 10 days, there have been pushes by Rishi Sunak to cut the number of student visas on offer. He says he only wants them going to the brightest and the best, and he wants to limit the number, in brackets, to bring down the number of students in his migration figures. But this is going to have what looks to be an extraordinary unintended consequence, not just on foreign students coming here, but on our own students and what they're able to do at the universities themselves.
Look, over the course of this podcast, we have talked endlessly about the divisions within the Conservative Party, with those on the Brexiteer right, European Research Group and others who believe that what the Conservatives need to do is bring down net migration figures. And this is just the latest battleground for the right of the Conservative Party and the mainstream bit of the Conservative Party. And David Cameron has waded into that row and saying, you can't just give in and stop these graduate visas, which allow a graduate overseas student to work in the UK for 2 years, because it's not being abused. The government commissioned a report from the Migration Advisory Committee to look into whether it was being abused, and they came up with the conclusion that the integrity and quality of the higher education system was not being affected by it. So there is no problem. But of course, the right on the Conservative Party is saying, no. If you order white paint, you get a whitewash. And that's what Robert Jenrick, the former immigration minister, has said.
I mean, I think this goes back to the sheer panic that you can feel in Rishi's own head, which is he's looking at the immigration figures. He's seeing this massive rise in the years post-Brexit, which obviously ought to have been the time, according to the Brexiteers, when we would have had control, we would have taken back control, we could have decided the number. And he's seen that net migration is up. And he's pointed to the one thing that probably, almost certainly, is not the problem, which is students coming here for 2 years. And what he's already done is said students can't bring dependents, they can't bring family, and the cost of the visas themselves has gone up. But he now thinks that the quickest way to create a headline, an actual cut in numbers, is to start making it harder for students to get those visas at all. And the knock-on effect, as we're going to hear, is what that lack of money, students paying huge fees to our universities, will mean to the universities themselves.
But it's also fascinating. You talk about the battle going on within Rishi Sunak's head. Every instinct, my guess would be, is that Rishi Sunak believes in higher education,
Yeah.
believes in the
Study abroad.
Study abroad.
Done it himself,
He did it
met his
himself.
wife there.
And this is what the great American success story is. If you go to Silicon Valley, which is where Rishi Sunak was, you look at the cultural imports from around the world of the brightest and best brains as the driver for economic growth in that part of tech land in California.
So he would say, I'm putting words in his head now, in his mouth, but he would say, fine, when it's the brightest and the best. Rishi Sunak, probably was the brightest and the best. You know, his wife probably was the brightest and the best. What he's saying is there's a lot of people coming here who aren't the brightest and the best. They're throwing money at the universities, yes, but in exchange, they're getting not just the visa for 2 years, but the chance maybe to stay on as long as they want, and those are pushing the numbers up. He will say it is about refining the system, not shutting the system, but refining the system to only have the very smartest.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that works in practice.
Well, but it's also about the economics of higher education.
Yeah.
The government has not raised tuition fees for a decade. They're still around £9,250, I think, is the maximum you can charge for a domestic student. So you have got an enormous shortfall if you are going to fund the research work that Rishi Sunak says he wants to see. And so the place has been filled by, those places have been filled by a lot of overseas students who are paying full tuition fees for their education. And that is what is keeping universities afloat.
Right.
Universities also keep towns afloat. Often the university, in wherever it happens to be, is the biggest employer around.
Yeah, and I guess there will be students now who hear you talking about, the levels of student debt being out of date, who want to throw up their hands in exasperation because clearly to those who are paying it off, it is a huge weight of their income and their expenditure, and it is a regressive tax for many of them. If you're a nurse, you might end up paying off more of your student debt for longer because you are not earning as much as quickly than if, for example, you were a doctor. Well, in a moment, we're going to go to a Vice-Chancellor and talk about the effect it's having on his university and others. But before we do that, we're going to hear an example. This woman is from Mexico. Her name is Elena Rodriguez Falcon. She's now a professor. She came here to study. She became an engineer. And she not only stayed, but she then invested all her research and her career into building up the higher education system in the UK.
I'm so worried about the current narrative regarding international students. If the government makes a significant move or makes further moves to limit international students coming to the UK, I see two key impacts. The first one is financial. International students make it possible for both to fund domestic students and cross-subsidized research. Is such an important input to our economy in general. But the second is on our society at large and our soft power in the world. Attracting talented students from around the world enriches us because we gain global perspectives, and when these students go back to their countries, they do so as advocates of the UK, and I am an example of that.
So the whole point there is the soft power and the real power that overseas students have brought this country. And you look around the world, and we have a fantastic university system. The idea that we're going to make it more difficult to attract talent to come to this country by denying students the chance to work for 2 years at the end of it, it seems pretty short-sighted. You do all this just in search of the headline tomorrow that net migration figures have come down. Well, we're joined now by Charlie Jeffrey. He is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of York and has been rather outspoken on what the government may be planning in terms of restricting graduate visas. What would be the impact on your university if the government goes ahead and cracks down on graduate visas?
There's a direct impact and an indirect one. There's very, very clearly a link between the policies that governments impose on, the rules they impose on student migration and student numbers. We've seen universities which had a January intake of students this year, we don't, lose about 40% of their international applicants. The Russell Group is currently anticipating an average of a 10% decline in applicants later this year. And we're pretty much on that that kind of mark at the University of York. So that's a direct impact. The indirect impacts are really, really significant. We've ended up in a system in the UK where the brilliant research that universities like mine do is underfunded. We've ended up with a system where undergraduate home student teaching is underfunded. And we've ended up in a situation where postgraduate courses, which UK students take, wouldn't be viable without international students. International students make up the gap in all of those cases. So if you do things which damage our capability to recruit them, you have an impact on research, you have an impact on our ability to afford to teach home undergraduate students and the viability of postgraduate courses.
Charlie, there might be students listening to this who think, well, surely if there are fewer international students coming over, then my chances of getting great places at great universities are increased. Why isn't that a benefit for, if you like, homegrown students then?
Well, that's absolutely not the case, because we've had a situation where the two income streams around home students, that's the fees they pay and the government grants that get added to help pay for more expensive courses, have been flat for about a decade or more. And that means that inflation has gradually nibbled away at the real value of that income. And in the last couple of years, have eaten great big chunks out of it.
But isn't the argument that kind of you hear again and again is that international students are taking away the places of home students?
That is absolutely not the case. The opposite is true. International student income is the most important part of our portfolio.
So you can stay open as a university because you've got the income coming in from overseas students.
That's how the system has evolved over the last decade or so. I don't think anybody intended to evolve in that direction, but that is the situation we face now, where the core activities of universities in research and in teaching home students are now dependent on international students.
So just give us the top line then. If international students don't get the visas, what happens to York and other universities like you?
We'd have to look at the breadth of courses that we offer, or a restriction in the wider range of activities that we do. Now, universities like York, and I think this applies especially outside of the Golden Triangle, are absolutely vital to the economies of the places that surround them.
Is the bigger question one about student tuition fees themselves? I mean, would you accept that £9,000 doesn't cut it anymore, even though it feels massive to many of the students who have to pay it?
One thing we should never lose sight of in these discussions about money are the students, both the international students who bring all sorts of vitality to our campuses and all sorts of long-term advantages to the UK, and our home students who I concede they think they're paying a lot, but the money doesn't go as far as it used to. That doesn't necessarily mean whacking more fees on top of the existing levels. It might mean thinking harder about the repayment system we have, which is one which is actually very regressive in its impacts. It used to be much more progressive. And I think we should be looking into the medium term at that calculation of, how should we fund our university system? As I said, nobody intended it to be like this. It has evolved in this direction. I think we need to take an opportunity to step back and think more strategically about how to fund our universities and the various kinds of value that they bring to our society.
Vice-Chancellor, I'm trying to work out whether what you're saying is sort of shroud waving, because no organisation likes to have cuts in its budgets, and whether this is just the kind of normal political debate, or whether you think, and I'd be interested in your answer to this, do you think some academic institutions could go bust if this report is rejected?
There is a situation, a moment of peril in the higher education sector. If we keep piling up these pressures, that long-term erosion of the value of home fees and these successive steps in making it more difficult for universities to recruit international students, then that really is a possible consequence.
So universities could go bust.
That's a danger that the government really needs to think about.
Vice-Chancellor, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do think what's interesting politically about where we've got to with this story is that we're used to seeing Sunak be sort of buffeted by, as you said, the right of the party. Now he's got Jeremy Hunt, his Chancellor, David Cameron, his Foreign Secretary, a former Prime Minister, elected Prime Minister. You've got Gillian Keegan, his Secretary of State for Education. I wonder if those three beasts will actually be enough to kind of put Sunak back in his box in this one, because it's pretty rare, isn't it, that you'd hear other members of the cabinet saying, mate, with all due respect, you're on the wrong track here.
I think what it underlines is the scale of the battle that is going on within government, that David Cameron has felt it necessary to let it be known that this is what he is thinking.
Yeah.
You know,
because it's not really Foreign Secretary stuff.
I mean, it's about Britain's position overseas. So, yeah,
Soft
technically, soft power, he can claim that it does have impinge on his area. But if Rishi Sunak's central argument to the British people is that he is building a world-class economy and that we are going to be the envy of the world and we're going to bring back growth and all the rest of it.
And your Chancellor doesn't agree with that.
And your Chancellor doesn't agree with it and your Foreign Secretary doesn't agree with it. And they kind of are people who want to grow the UK economy by innovation and getting the brightest and the best foreigners in this country working for Britain, and presumably graduates who spend an extra 2 years here are exactly in that space. It shows that there is a real battle going on.
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to a theme that we've picked up on so often before, which is Rishi Sunak is not very good at politics.
No.
If he hasn't even run this past his Foreign Secretary and his Chancellor before announcing it.
Yeah, and again, it shows also weakness in the sense that cabinet ministers are breaking cover on discussions that are going to be before the cabinet. Though any discussion normally is held within the cabinet room. You might get the odd leak afterwards, but normally you don't start putting your position out in public in advance, and yet everyone feels free to do that right now.
Last year, the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, changed the definition of serious disruption in terms of protesting to mean that anything more than minor protest would give the police what felt like unlimited powers to shut down protests. Well, she got taken to court by the human rights group Liberty, who we had on this podcast a few months ago. Today, they won their case. What Suella is trying to do is now unlawful.
What it seemed that Suella was trying to do was to say, yeah, Emily Maitlis, you look like you might be an environmental campaigner. I'm arresting you for being, well, I don't know what you're being, but just in case you were thinking of having a protest, I'm stopping.
Don't like the look of that.
I don't like the look of you. One little bit, I'm stopping you right now.
Yeah.
Now, the context of it was just before the coronation of King Charles, and therefore there was a feeling that you don't want Just Stop Oil upending the big day for the king. So therefore, let us put in place some extra measures so the police can clamp down if they need to stop anything kind of disrupting and throwing themselves before the royal coach.
Yeah, but it was the legal equivalent of a sort of backhander to the police. And in this judgment today, the justices, Green and Kerr, said that the government had ignored Parliament's will in failing to define the meaning of serious disruption. Now, where have you heard that before? If there's been one, if you like, sort of key theme of the last 5-8 years maybe, it's been this sense that whatever government decided to do could somehow get round pesky Parliament, because pesky Parliament was getting in the way. We'll prorogue it if we need to. We'll go round the back if we need to. I'm sure there's a stage door somewhere if we need to. And the justices today have given this ruling that you cannot ignore the will of Parliament.
And also, not unreasonably, the justices have said you can't just say to the police you have almost unlimited power to restrict protest without there being some boundaries and definition of where the line is.
Not least because it's really unfair for the police. Didn't you understand what we meant by almost? Well, no, frankly, I didn't.
And it did put the police in the most invidious position where the government has said, look, we've given you a ton of power. You sort it out.
You use it.
You use it. And then the police find themselves in a position where they're saying, hang on.
Yeah. Use it, but don't abuse it.
Yeah.
Well, what's that mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what's happened is that one of the great temples of Suella Braverman's period as Home Secretary seems to have come
crashing down,
tumbling down.
The government, we should say, is not letting it rest here. It believes it has a very strong case to make in allowing police more powers to shut down unruly protests, and they're appealing. Before we go, we want to just play you a clip by Stuart Lee, one of Britain's best-loved comedians, and a man who has a habit of satirising things that shortly afterwards become true.
So I was in a cab on a Sunday night going from Waterloo to Hackney, and suddenly the cab driver turned round and his opening conversational gambit was to say this genuine sentence. He said, "These days you get arrested and thrown in jail if you say you're English, don't you?" Look, we've all done it. You're probably like me. Sometimes a cab driver, someone might say something like that and you go, yeah, just for a quiet life. Or if they go, "My face is made out of electricity and ham," you go, "Yes, it's awful when that happens. My friend had that, an electric ham face." Or if they go, "All mice are gay and they're from space, aren't they?" You go, "Yeah, they're bloody gay space mice. I can't stand them. They make me physically sick." You're just, for a quiet life. But on this occasion, I thought I'd wonder what he means. I said to him, "What did you say?" And he said, "Oh, these days, if you say you're English, you get arrested and thrown in jail." I said, "When did this come in?"
So you get the gist. It goes on and on with Stuart Lee getting increasingly confused about why this taxi driver thinks that you'll get arrested and thrown in jail for saying you're English. Anyway, today, in a wonderful moment, life imitated art.
And we'll just leave you with the comments of Mr. Lee Anderson, MP, Member of Parliament. And it's a picture of a full English breakfast. 2 sausages, black pudding, mushrooms, eggs, bacon, sausages. A great start to the day. But how long before some highly educated expert tells us our traditional breakfast is racist?
We'll be back tomorrow. See you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.